I have some practice questions for the essay questions in here. Okay, so this first one is an example of a kind of problem that you will get on the exam. That is how to design an experiment to test indirect effects in a community. So this is like an example problem. I think this is real. I can't remember if I made this up or not. No, this is real. So in streams in Trinidad, guppies feed on mosquito larvae. The mosquito larvae compete with brine shrimp for their main food source, volvox. So brine shrimp compete with mosquito larvae to eat volvox. Design an experiment to test the indirect effects of guppies on brine shrimp and volvox populations. So we are studying their indirect effects because guppies guppies feed on mosquito larvae. They don't feed on brine shrimp. This I'm not sure is true. I might have made that up. But so they feed on the mosquito larvae, but the mosquito larvae compete with the brine shrimp to feed on volvox. So these dotted lines represent the indirect effects. So they don't have a direct interaction, but they have an indirect interaction by feeding on these mosquito larvae that compete with the brine shrimp. And the mosquito larvae feed on the volvox. So what I would like you to do is, for this practice question, let's design an experiment where you test the indirect effect of guppies on brine shrimp and the indirect effect of guppies on volvox. So anybody have any suggestions on how you might go about doing that? And I don't have the chat open, so hold on, let me. I will let any ideas?
I mean, if I understand the situation correctly, basically, if we create a controlled experiment, so we'll probably need a huge tank to include all 4 species. There would be a control there would be no guppies, and there would be one where there would be guppies. And the other 3 species should probably be present in all 2 groups. And then we could see that if the guppies eat more of the mosquito larva, then what would happen to the brine shrimp population and the volvox population? And then we could also do one where there is no guppies and see how the brine shrimp population and the volvox population gets affected.
Yeah, that's a perfect way, a really simple way to test the effect of the guppies, the indirect effect of them on these other species, is to just have an experiment where you have the guppies in the tank with these other 3 species, and then the guppies not in the tank, and then look at how the populations of each of the 3 species increase or decrease in the presence of guppies or without the presence of guppies. Some other ways that I've seen people answer these in the past is a little more complicated, whereas you change the total number of individuals of each of the 4 species that you put into the tank and then see how they affect it. So that's a more like fine scale, but the really simple way is to just design an experiment with and without guppies. What are some hypotheses that you might make about, so what I'd like you to do on the exam is come up with some hypotheses for obviously this is not going to be the one on the exam. It will be slightly different, but it'll be different species, but the diagram will be very similar. So like come up with a hypothesis for how you think each of the 2 species, volvox and, I should just point with my mouse, volvox and brine shrimp might be affected. So what's a hypothesis you might have about the indirect effect of guppies on Volvox plankton? Oh, wait, Phil's got one. So if we remove guppies, brine shrimp population will grow and Volvox would decrease. That's a really good hypothesis. So if you remove the guppies, well, let's see. If you also have the mosquito larvae though, so it's still a good hypothesis because you have like explicit predictions in there. But if you remove the guppies, the main predator of the mosquitoes, and the mosquitoes compete with the brine shrimp for Volvox plankton, my hypothesis would be that the mosquito larvae would increase in population size because their main predator is gone. They would perhaps outcompete the brine shrimp for the Volvox plankton to feed on, which would then cause the brine shrimp population to decrease, but maybe the Volvox population would stay the same. I'm not sure. I mean, honestly, any hypothesis for the Volvox population would be plausible as long as you can like explain your rationale behind it. So, I mean, really, as long as you have a good rationale, yeah, okay. So like as long as you have a good rationale for your hypothesis and your answer on the exam, then that'll be good. But maybe, yeah, so maybe the Volvox population would decrease because perhaps maybe the mosquitoes eat Volvox at a higher rate than the brine shrimp. But then conversely, you might expect that if you have guppies in there, the mosquito larvae population might decrease. Perhaps the brine shrimp population would increase because they're not competing with the mosquito larvae for the Volvox. And then again, with the Volvox population, you could see it depends on like the feeding rate of brine shrimp versus mosquito larvae. If brine shrimp are really voracious herbivores of Volvox, then you might expect that population to decrease. It just depends. But so make sure when you're on the essay questions for the exam that you are including an experimental design in here. You're saying, and be very specific about what species will be in each treatment, how you're going to measure the progress of your experiments, and then also include in there how you will know whether or not your hypothesis is supported or rejected. And this will all be written, so I'll make it very clear exactly what I expect in the answer from you. Oh, get out here, Java. Any questions on this type of question that might be on the exam? I got the chat open if y'all want to type in it. I can't see y'all's faces right now. Okay. Okay, next example. So another thing that's listed on the study guide is designing an experiment to study succession. Oh man, I just thought of I might add a new question about succession to the exam. I just thought of something really good to add. Okay, so this one is studying primary succession. So if you remember from the lectures, primary succession is colonization of a new land that did not exist before. How do you get new land that did not exist before? Volcanoes make a thing in the ocean. Or in this one, this really sad post-apocalyptic scenario I have created for this example, a land of floating trash is floating around in the ocean. That is another way that they study primary succession too is sometimes I think I covered this in the lecture, sometimes they'll just like throw cement blocks into the ocean and see what, and see what colonizes it. So that's, again, that's primary because you're throwing something in, like it's a new piece that has never existed, new geographic location that has not existed before. So in this scenario, it's a floating trash off the coast of Brazil. I think I made this one up. How would you design an experiment to study primary succession on these islands? Any ideas?
You could have a team of scientists with boats, like
Mhm.
studying like around the island. I mean, I don't even know if you're a human, if you could step on it, right? I mean, what would be on this hypothetical island of garbage?
I don't know. I made it up. So that's what you're trying to find out, right? So like
that you could go there. It would definitely not be like plants and stuff like that. It would definitely be things that can swim around, like seals and things that can move.
yeah, so how you would do, I mean, and this is true for really the same is true for studies of secondary succession as well, is you just send a team of scientists out there to see what lives on it. And you would want to do that as soon as you realize that things are living on it, so that you have a study from the very beginning of the start. So in the lectures, I talked about studies of succession that start at the very beginning of a new land or a new exposure of land, where you start from time point 0, but you can also study succession in the middle of it if you have historical records that you can use to reconstruct, or you can construct like a seer. So I talked about these sand dunes in the lecture on succession, where they knew these sand dunes were of varying ages and they knew how long they had been there. And so they basically used like the oldest ones to kind of predict what will happen in the future to the younger sand dunes. And that's how they constructed like the pattern of succession that was happening in these sand dune environments. So with this one, this is a different kind of study. You're there at the very beginning at time point 0. So you can just go back every year and sample what lives there and then see what colonizes it. What you also would want to do in a study of succession is, depending on how far these islands are from the coast of Brazil, you could study the closest point of mainland where the colonizers might be coming from and see how does it compare to the mainland. So what proportion of the species diversity that's on the mainland is then colonizing this new land, and how that might help you predict who's colonizing this new piece of land that's been newly exposed. And then the hypothesis that I'm looking for on these is just for you to demonstrate a general understanding of how succession works in most terrestrial communities. So in most terrestrial communities, especially if it's like a newly exposed place that has literally never had anything on it before, like rock or something, the first colonizers are going to be things that are autotrophs, lichens, mostly lichens actually. Lichens can grow on rocks, and they're mostly autotrophs that generate their own food and photosynthesize. So you're going to get not anything probably with roots, because they need soil. So mostly you're going to get lichens as the early colonizers. As those lichens proliferate and then they decay and they die, they start to form the beginnings of what is soil. And so then you'll start to get, once you start to get like some sort of decomposition happening of the lichens, you get things that start to have roots. So you get mosses and maybe some grasses. Oh shit, this background picture on my computer is a perfect demonstration of that right now. Why am I swearing on Zoom? Okay, I'm gonna share my other screen. Oh, can I do that? Is it on this computer? Oh, damn! My computer background's perfect for talking about secondary succession. I'll talk about that later. Okay. Sorry, I got way off track. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, so you got lichens, moss. Those are the first colonizers. Then that stuff dies, makes soil. Then you get grasses and maybe some mosses. That stuff dies, builds up a thicker soil layer with things that have deeper roots and need more structure. Then you start to get woody things and sedges. Again, and then as this process continues and continues, then you start to get trees. You start to get things that need really stable, high nutrient rich soils, and then you get trees, and you get like climax communities, which are forest communities. So I'm looking for, when I ask you to make a hypothesis about the pattern of succession, that's what I'm looking for you, is for you to understand these specific species that colonize at the early, middle, and late stages of succession. And okay, as I talk about that, I do want to share my desktop background on my main. Don't look at how messy my desktop is though, because this is like, actually, I want you to tell me what stage of succession you might think this is in. Okay, what stage of succession is this place in? Can you guys see like mountains and stuff? No? Anybody?
Yes.
Okay, you see mountains? Okay. What's growing here? You got some rocks, some moss, some like woody bushes.
Like early middle.
Yeah, this is like early middle succession. And actually, this community will almost always be in early middle succession because this is tundra in the Arctic Circle. So this here is the Brooks Range in Alaska. And then this is one of the field sites I was sampling when I was studying Arctic bumblebees up there. I think I took this picture at like 9 p.m. at night because we went when it was 24 hours. Well, no, it was dark for 30 minutes a night. But Arctic areas are almost always in an early stage of succession. You almost never see any trees there because the summers are not long enough for things to grow and then die to build up really strong, stable soils. So even if you look in some of these mountains, well, up there in the tundra regions, it's just like rock and snow. There's like almost no plants whatsoever. Yeah, okay. Let me go to the next question. Okay, oh, before I go to that next question, any questions on primary succession and like designing an experiment for primary succession? Okay. Okay, let's go to this one. Okay, so this hypothetical experiment is looking at this volcano in Hawaii that erupts almost on a yearly basis. And there are really detailed records of the lava flows there. So for this one, I want you to design a chronosequence, which is what I just talked about with those sand dunes. It's called a chronosequence when you know the exact age of certain areas of land, and then you use those ages to back calculate the patterns of succession that have happened in those communities. And this is, again, primary succession because lava flows are new land that did not exist before. So that's primary succession as opposed to secondary. So how would you design an experiment for this? Any ideas? Oh, I forgot to open the chat. Any ideas on how you would do this? If not, I'll tell you.
I mean, it would pretty much be similar to the previous one in the sense that it's a kind of an observational study. You would just do it separate for each of these, like, separate lava flows that you all know their ages, so you can compare it in a sequential manner. So you can kind of create a sequence of events in real life.
Yeah, exactly. It's the same methods. It's just you are then adding this variable of age into it to construct the chrono sequence. This experiment takes a lot longer because you're at the very beginning. This one, you're using historical records to calculate what has happened back in time. So like you pick maybe like a lava flow of like 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, 7 year, 50 year, 100 year, depending on what you know about the species that live there. And then you would quantify species diversity, mostly plants. When we're talking about succession, we're mostly talking about plants. And then you would like look at plant diversity in each of these communities. And then you would use the age of them to then construct the chrono sequence. So you'd use whatever is colonizing 1 through 3. Those are your hypothetical early colonizers, early successional species. Then maybe like the ones that are like 10 to 20 years old, those would be like your middle colonizers. And then like 50 to 100, those would be like late successional species. So same methods, just you're adding that variable of time because you have that known variable already. Okay. Any questions on that before I go? Oh yeah. Okay, no, never mind. That's related to this question. Any questions on that before I go to this one? Okay.
Wait, I'm just
Oh yeah.
I'm just typing the rest of the last one. So you said species that are like 1 to 3 years old are like colonizers, and species that are 10 to 20 years old are like successional species, and the species that are 50 to 100 years old are like late successional species.
Yeah. So like early successional is like, and it depends on how old a community can get, but usually we're thinking like hundreds of years. So it'd be like 1 to 10 would be like early successional. And then like, 20 to 30 would be like middle successional species. And then like, 50 into like the hundreds would be late successional species.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. That was a good question. Okay, so this hypothetical question is based on a real life scenario. Has anybody in here been to, I was thinking maybe some of the environmental science majors, have any of you been to the Betty Smith Center?
Dr. Kellum took some of us there for, is that like the farm place?
It's not is it a farm? There's not like farmland there, but there is a house. So
I think that's where Dr. Kellum took some of us there for the World Series of Birds.
oh, okay.
Actually.
There's a lot of like wooded lot. It's like mostly wooded lot, and there's like a barn and there's a house there.
Yeah, I think that's where we went.
Okay, I knew some people had been. Probably not in the house yet because it is scary. So there was this priest who was a Benedictine monk who was a prison chaplain that I guess it wasn't a monk because he had a lot of money. He had this house in this massive barn, horse barn outside of Pittsburgh, and he donated it to St. Vincent for it to become an environmental research center. I went on a tour of it 2 years ago, and he had died 5 years before that, and the refrigerator was still full of his food. There are 2 jacuzzis in his house, which is like, it is a wild place. There's a lot of work that needs to be done before it's turned into a research station. But anyway, St. Vincent has this land, and someday we will have an environmental research center. Some of the land there, not a lot of it, has been used for growing crops, but it's basically just an unattended field. Okay, so design an experiment where you'll use this land to study secondary succession in Pennsylvania. Now remember, those first two examples were about primary succession. This one is about secondary. So this is land that has been cleared and is being recolonized by species. So what do I mean by cleared? It could be mowed down for agriculture and then maybe not taken care of. It could be set on fire and everything got burned. It could avalanche is one I learned about. Avalanche is the main determining factor of succession in Rocky Mountain National Park, which I didn't know until I went there this summer. And I was like, that is awesome. I never thought about avalanches as like successional starters. So avalanches, fires, did I say fires, agriculture, clearing out, logging, flood, those kinds of things that clear the land, kill all the species there, and then start it anew. That's what I mean by secondary succession. So how would you design an experiment to study secondary succession and on this land? And if you remember anything from the lecture, think about Phillips tract that I mentioned, which is a successional experiment at the University of Illinois. If you remember or even watched the video yet.
You can design an experiment to look at this by looking at from the time that the building like stopped being maintained or like the plot of land stopped being maintained. I'm sure there's like photographs or documentation of what the actual land looked like before they stopped maintaining it. Then you can compare it to, the species that you find when it has not been maintained after X amount of years and see the growth in which direction it has occurred.
Yeah, that's one way. How they do it at Phillips tract is they have one plot of land that they have just not touched since the University of Illinois acquired it. And that's got forests and stuff on it because it's been there for like 100 years now. The other thing that you could do is every, 5, 7, and 15 years, you have plots that you clear out and you replicate succession and you look at what species colonize it so that you can actually do a successional experiment that is replicated so that you can see how common are certain species during various amounts of time allowed for succession. And you can repeat those patterns. That's how they do it at Phillips tract. So they have these areas of land that they mow every 3, 5, and 7 years. And then they look at and you can tell which ones are which by what species have colonized each of them. So the 7-year one has more wildflowers and it has a few like woody plants like elderberry and stuff. The 5-year has mostly like native grasses and some other like really easily colonized like goldenrod, something that spreads really quickly. And then the 1-year one just has like really short grass and basically nothing else growing in it. So that's how you would design something for a plot of land like that. Speaking of secondary succession, this is my favorite plot of land that I did a little bit of study of secondary succession in Yosemite National Park. This is a forest that caught on fire 5 years before I sampled bees in there. And the flower diversity was just like insane. I think there were like 25 different species of wildflowers in this plot. I loved it. It's one of my favorite field sites. I don't think it looks like this anymore because it caught on fire again. But and class is over. Does anybody have any more questions on anything?
I have one question from like chapter 16.
Uh-huh.
It's just like about the keystone species. You talked about the sea otters. I was kind of just wondering why like the whales aren't the keystone species, but like the otters are.
That's a good question. I think it's because the otters have a more direct impact on the plant communities because they eat the sea urchins.
Okay.
That would be my guess.
Okay, because I was like thinking and it said like, how everything changed when like the whales came in. So I was just like, it kind of seems like that would be the keystone species.
I think you could probably actually argue that both of them are.
Okay.
Yeah. Anybody else have any questions? If not, you're free to go.